The Inheritance of the Sorcerer, Kings, Chapter 4, The First Lie of Bellgrave. I am Bryce Vare, Keeper of the Quiet Archive, and this is Chapter 4, The First Lie of Bellgrave. The Covenant of the Seven Lamps did not send Canon the Sul'Urvain to Bellgrave quickly. This is the first thing to understand about him, and about what he represents. He was not a crisis response. He was a calibrated response. There is a difference. A crisis response is dispatched at the moment of maximum urgency, with maximum resources and minimum preparation time. A calibrated response is dispatched after a careful assessment of what kind of situation has developed and what kind of intervention it requires. Canon the Cell was the Covenant's answer to the question of how to manage the meaning of what had happened in Bellgrave, and the fact that this was the question the Covenant was primarily asking, 2 days into a crisis that had killed 3 people and left the hospital working without divine support, tells you a great deal about the institution. I want to be fair to them, because fairness is the only lens through which what follows becomes fully comprehensible. The Covenant of the Seven Lamps was very old. It had survived plagues, schisms, political upheavals, the deaths of multiple patron powers, several wars, and the slow erosion of divine responsiveness that characterized the last 2 centuries of the current age. It had survived these things in part because it was good at what it did. Its healers genuinely healed. Its rites had worked for generations. Its administrative structures had fed and housed and educated populations that would otherwise have been without those things. And it had survived because it understood, with the long institutional memory of something that has outlasted many individual crises, that public faith is a resource, that it requires maintenance, that the maintenance of public faith sometimes requires the management of public information. Canon Thessel believed all of this sincerely. He was not a cynical man. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good man operating within a framework that had taught him, not incorrectly, given his experience, that the alternative to narrative management was narrative chaos, and that narrative chaos killed people as surely as plague. He was also wrong about Bellgrave, but he arrived before he could know that. They came through the south gate at the 3rd hour after noon on the 3rd day, a procession of 12, which was not large enough to be impressive and not small enough to be subtle. Clean white robes, which was the first thing Kael noticed. The particular clean of fabric that had been laundered that morning in a place with adequate water and a reasonable calm. The kind of clean that was conspicuous in a town where no one had changed their clothes in 3 days. Covered lanterns on poles, still burning in the afternoon gray. A sealed wagon with the Covenant's gold lamp embossed on its panels. Guards in light armor who stepped around the worst of the mud with the practiced delicacy of people who have learned to maintain presentation in adverse conditions. Townspeople had gathered at the gate. This was understandable. The arrival of any significant Covenant delegation was an event in Bellgrave under ordinary circumstances, and these were not ordinary circumstances. They watched from the sides of the road with the particular expression of people who desperately need help and are not yet certain whether what has arrived is help or management. Several knelt. A few called out prayers. A child of about 6 years stood in the center of the road until a grandmother pulled him out of the way of the lead horse. Canon Thessel rode at the center of the procession. He was a man of about 50, built economically, but the kind of face that had been sharp in youth and had settled into something more considered with age. He wore the administrative sash of a high canonical officer over his white robe, and he had positioned himself in the procession so that he could be seen by the townspeople without appearing to have arranged this, which was a skill that takes years to develop and looks like naturalness when done correctly. He dismounted at the temple steps and addressed the gathered townspeople before he had done anything else, before he had met with the hospital administration, or received a briefing, or done any of the things that an arriving official typically does first. He stepped forward and he spoke in the way that people speak when they have been trained to speak to frightened crowds, warmly, at a volume that implied intimacy rather than address, with the particular cadence of someone who knows that the quality of language in a crisis shapes the texture of the crisis itself. Bellgrave's faithfulness is known to us, he said. We have come because Bellgrave is not forgotten. Whatever has come upon this town, you have not been left to meet it alone. Several people wept. Kael, standing at the back of the gathered crowd beside Mara, watched this happen with the expression of someone who is trying to determine whether what they are observing is genuine care or skilled performance, and finding the two so thoroughly integrated that the distinction had ceased to be useful. Mara watched Thessel with a different expression, the attentiveness of someone who is listening to what is being said and also to what is not being said, cataloging both with professional precision. Inside the temple, in the first meeting between Thessel and the hospital's senior administrators, the tone changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to anyone listening from outside the door. But Mara was in the room, and she heard the first question that Thessel asked, once the formal expressions of concern were complete, and the question was, who has spoken publicly about the nature of what has occurred here? I need a full accounting of external communication since the incident began. Not, what do the patients need? Not, what resources can we send? The first operative question was about message management. Mara asked, when do the additional healers arrive? Thessel looked at her with the expression of someone who respects a direct question and will give it a direct answer that is also, structurally, an evasion. The situation is being assessed, he said. Once we understand what we are dealing with, appropriate resource allocation can be determined. 3 people have died, Mara said. The hospital is operating without divine healing and is managing approximately 40 patients on manual medicine. That is what we are dealing with. Marshal Vey. His voice was not unkind. You have done exceptional work here. All of you have. What I need from you now is to help me ensure that we can continue that work without the additional burden of unconstrained public fear. He looked around the room. Witness lists. A full record of all communications that have left this hospital since the incident began, and the lower levels are to be sealed pending investigation. His gaze stopped briefly on Eloan, who stood near the wall with the expression of someone who had been expecting precisely this. The records rooms as well, he added. 2. Thessel addressed the town at the 5th hour from the temple steps, with the gathered crowd in the courtyard and the rain beginning again, light and persistent, the kind of rain that is not heavy enough to drive people inside, but cold enough to remind them that they are standing in it. He was very good at this. Kael had not expected him to be quite this good at it, which was a failure of imagination on Kael's part. He had seen institutional figures speak to frightened crowds before, and they had generally been clumsy at it, too aware of the mechanism to execute it cleanly. Thessel was not clumsy. He spoke with the quality of a man who had spent 30 years finding language that could carry people through crisis without requiring them to understand the crisis, and he had found it. The language was beautiful. It was genuinely beautiful. He did not say the gods had failed. He said the gods were present in ways mortals could not always perceive. He did not say the healing rites were not working. He said that the divine channel, as with all channels of holy grace, moved according to purposes that required wisdom and patience to discern. He did not say divine silence. He said a season of spiritual deepening, which was a phrase that had no information content whatsoever, but produced in the people listening a feeling of significance and belonging that was, in the short term, stabilizing. In our faithfulness, he said, we are not required to understand. We are required to continue. Several people nodded. Several people who had been weeping, quietly, in the rain, stopped weeping, which was not the same thing as those people being better, but which functioned, for the purposes of the crowd, as a kind of resolution. Then, and Kael watched this moment with the particular attention of someone who is watching something he cannot stop, the cell's language shifted. He spoke about the importance of communal purity. He spoke about how divine channels could be disrupted not only by external forces, but by internal ones, by errors of practice or commitment, by the hidden failures of individuals whose compromised relationship with the sacred might affect, in ways difficult to trace, the responsiveness of the divine to a community as a whole. He did not say, one of you may have caused this, but the sentence was present in the room, assembled from the pieces he had given it. Kael watched 2 men in the crowd exchange a look that belonged to a long-standing disagreement about a shared fence line. He watched a woman step slightly away from the man beside her, creating a distance that had not been there before. He watched a father with a sick child turn to look at the family standing next to him with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from shared fear to evaluation. Blame is a direction, he said, quietly, to Eloan beside him. Give people a direction and they will walk in it. Eloan had gone still during the speech, in the specific way she went still when she was preventing herself from acting. Her hands were at her sides, flat against her robe, and her jaw was set with the precision of someone holding a door closed. Don't, she said, not to Kyle, to herself. Below the steps, a man whose daughter had died in the hospital the previous night turned to the family beside him and said, in a voice that was not loud but carried in the acoustic space of the courtyard, that he had always had questions about certain practices on that side of the road, and it was interesting timing, was it not? The family on that side of the road went rigid. Mara was already moving through the crowd before the sentence was fully spoken, not running but covering ground quickly, placing herself between the two families with the physical authority of someone who does not need to speak first. She said something quiet, and her hand was on the grieving father's arm, and her body was turned in a way that redirected the attention of the crowd without confronting it. She had done things like this before. She was good at them. But she had heard what Diesel said, and she had watched what it produced. And she was now doing the work of undoing, in real time, a consequence that had been engineered by a man, standing on the steps above her, who was still speaking beautifully. Thur. They met in the treatment room off the inner ward, the one that locked from the inside. Aloan brought the 3 records she had not yet surrendered. She set them on the table and stood with her back to the door and looked at Kale and Mara and said, "I should have told you this yesterday." "I am telling you now." The records were not the same ones that Thessel's administration had just ordered sealed. Those were the hospital's official records. These were different, the copies from the locked room, the ones that had been kept apart from the official record for 19 years by Elowen, and, before her, by her teacher, and before her teacher by the woman who had trained her, who had understood that the official record had been curated and that the curation had a direction. The first record was a hospital log from 41 years prior. Its healing rite entries were standard until a period of approximately 6 days, during which the entries read, in the cramped medical shorthand of the era, lamp absent, rite ineffective, conventional treatment applied. 6 days, and then the entries resumed their normal form, as though the 6 days had not occurred. There was no explanatory notation. There was, in the margin, a small mark that Aloan identified as a classification symbol that the Covenant used for records that had been reviewed and authorized for archival in restricted collections. "Someone came and reviewed this record after the fact," she said. "They marked it. But they did not alter it, because altering it would have required corroboration that was difficult to obtain for an event 6 days long with multiple staff witnesses. Instead, they classified it, buried it where it could not be found on casual search." The second record was from 22 years prior, a different hospital, the outpost clinic at a village called Sarn, 3 days east of Bellgrave. Its silence had lasted 9 days. The record had been submitted to Care Thaler through official channels by the clinic's senior healer, who had also submitted a written account of the silence and a request for investigation. The written account was present in the copied materials. The official response was not, because there had not been one. What was present was a transfer notice. The senior healer had been reassigned to a coastal posting 7 weeks after submitting the account. The third record was more fragmentary. Partial notes from a healer at a temple in the Western Hill District, 11 years prior, describing a period of 3 days during which the healing channel had been, in her words, simply not present. She had reported it as a mechanical failure. She had asked whether the consecrated oil supply for that quarter had been correctly prepared. She had received a response advising her to review her own preparation practices. The channel had returned at the end of the 3 days. She had never reported it as divine silence because no one had given her language for it, and the language that was available, impure practice, practitioner error, inadequate commitment, had been sufficient to explain it to her own satisfaction incorrectly. Mara had not spoken during any of this. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her eyes moving from record to record with the systematic attention of someone who is not deciding whether to believe what she is seeing, but is instead constructing the full picture of what it means. She looked like someone discovering, with a kind of terrible clarity, that a wall she had believed to be structural is instead a curtain. "These should have gone to Care Thaler," she said. Her voice was steady. That was the training. Aloan said, "They did." Mara looked at her. "The originals went to Care Thaler," Elowen said. "All 3, through the proper channels, with the proper documentation." She picked up the first record and set it back down. They were received, classified, and filed in a restricted collection. The healers who submitted them were reassigned or counseled into silence. These are copies made before the originals were surrendered. She paused. They were made by people who suspected that surrender meant disappearance. They were correct. Kael had been standing at the window watching the courtyard below, where Thessel's staff were still managing the aftermath of the public address. He turned from the window. "How many people died?" he said, believing they were the only ones this had ever happened to. Neither Aloan nor Mara answered immediately. "The ones in these records were not the only ones," Aloan said finally. "These are the copies I have access to. There are more." There have been more. I do not know how many. Something in Kyle expression changed then. It was not a large change, and it did not produce any immediate action. But Mara, watching him, noted it. The particular expression of a person who has received information that fits into a space they had thought was private. He had been 17. His mother had been very sick. He had prayed in a silence that had felt, at the time, like the most personal abandonment in the world. He had carried that feeling for 16 years as something that belonged only to him, a specific grief that was his alone. It had happened before. It had happened many times before. It had been recorded and classified and managed, and the people who had lived through it had not been told about each other, and some of them had died inside their isolated understanding of an event that was not isolated at all. He said nothing. The expression came and went, and he turned back to the window. Mara, Elowen said, if you report these records through official channels. I know what happens, Mara said. Her voice was flat in the way that things go flat when they have been under too much pressure. I have been watching what happens for 3 days. The door of the treatment room shook, not knocked on, shaken, with the specific authority of someone who is not requesting entry. IV. There were 2 of them. Covenant guards in the administrative livery, heavier than the hospital's own attendants, with the bearing of men who had been given a task and were carrying out the task without particular investment in the people involved. They had a clerk with them, carrying a ledger, and behind the clerk was Canon Nessel himself, which was not something KL had expected. He had expected to be managed by subordinates. Vessel's presence in a service corridor outside a locked treatment room said something about how seriously he was taking the situation. Sister Elowen. Vessel's voice was still warm. He applied warmth the way skilled administrators apply most things, precisely, in the amount required for the specific effect desired. I understand you have been keeping certain supplemental records in a personal capacity. We would like to inventory and review those materials. Elowen stood in the treatment room doorway. She did not move aside. The records in question are patient medical records, she said, under the Covenant's own patient privacy protocols. The Covenant's protocols include a provision for administrative review in cases where records may bear on an event of doctrinal significance. Vessel glanced at the clerk, who noted something in the ledger. Given the current circumstances, this review is warranted. I am not asking you to surrender anything permanently. I am asking for a temporary administrative custody while we assess. Kyle noted the particular architecture of this. Temporary administrative custody, assess, assess. Each word chosen to make the action sound like a process rather than a conclusion. To replace the word confiscation with a sequence that pointed toward an eventual return that Vessel did not intend to facilitate. What you are asking for, Elowen said, is the evidence that this event has precedent. A small silence. I am asking for records that may be relevant to an ongoing doctrinal investigation, Vessel said. He had not changed his expression. He had the quality, remarkable in its way, of someone who can hold a conversation that is doing 2 things simultaneously without letting either register in his face. What those records contain is a matter for the investigation to determine. There was a healer in Sarn, Elowen said. 22 years ago. She submitted a full account. She was reassigned inside 2 months. Would her records be relevant to your investigation? Something moved across Vessel's face then. It was brief, the passage of a thought, possibly the passage of a choice, and then it was gone. Events at individual postings, he began, are subject to their own. There was a clinic in the Hill District 11 years ago, Elowen said, and a hospital in this town 41 years ago. And there are others I have found partial references to, others I have not been able to trace completely, and all of them were classified and their witnesses were managed, and I would like to know what word the Covenant uses internally for what happened in all those places and is happening here now. Vessel looked at her. He was a man who chose his words with the kind of care that implies full awareness of the words he is not choosing, and Kyle saw it happen. The word that was almost there, the phrase that had almost come out, the internal course correction of a man who had nearly said something that belonged to a vocabulary he did not use in front of people he did not fully control. He had almost named it. The word, or words, or phrase, had assembled itself on his tongue and then been disassembled, and in its place he chose other words. The Covenant takes its obligation to its communities seriously, he said. That includes the obligation to prevent the spread of misinterpretation during events that are not yet fully understood. What you are describing as evidence of a pattern, Sister Elowen, is something else entirely. a series of events, each with its own specific context, each managed by the Covenant with appropriate care for the communities involved. The appearance of pattern is a function of incomplete information. He looked at the records on the table behind her. Those materials need to come with us, Mara said. What were you about to say? He turned to her. Before, she said. You started to say something and then stopped. What was it, Marshal Vey? His voice had cooled by perhaps 1 degree. I understand. The last 3 days have been extraordinarily difficult. I understand that you have been managing a crisis largely without support, and I want to acknowledge that. But I need your cooperation now, not your resistance. I am asking what word the Covenant uses, Mara said, for what happened in those places, for what is happening here. I would like to know whether it has a name. Unauthorized theological speculation, Thessel said, is itself a form of... Alowan is to be detained, he said, to the guards. The guard on the left stepped forward. He was doing his job. This matters. He was not acting from malice or particular conviction. He was executing an order from a canonical authority. He had no structural reason to question, and the ordinariness of his action was its own kind of statement about what institutions can accomplish through unremarkable compliance. Mara stepped between him and Alowan. She did not draw her weapon. She did not raise her voice. She put herself in the space between the guard and the door with the physicality of someone who has been trained to occupy ground and knows how to do it without the escalation of drawn steel. And she stood there with her arms loose and her weight forward and looked at the guard with the expression of a person who is telling you, through their body, that this path leads somewhere neither of you will enjoy. The guard stopped. Behind her, she heard Kael make a small sound. Not a word, not quite, and she felt rather than saw him press back against the treatment room wall with his hand against his chest where the circlet was. The sound that reached him through the cloth and the stone was not, she understood, a quiet one. I am not refusing the lamps, she said. Her voice was even. She had practiced evenness for 30 years, and it was available to her now as a kind of tool, the way a healer's steadiness is a kind of tool, not absence of feeling, but deployment of it in the direction of what the moment requires. I am not refusing the Covenant. I am not refusing my rank, or my oath, or the authority of this institution in which I have served for 22 years. She looked at Thessel. I am refusing you, she said, in this moment, this specific order, this specific decision. Thessel's voice was very quiet when he answered. The warmth was still there, technically, but it had been reduced to structure, a shape from which the substance had been withdrawn. The distinction you are drawing, Marshal Vey, is one that the Covenant does not recognize. The authority of a canonical officer is not separable from the authority of the institution. Then the institution is wrong, Mara said, and I am refusing that too. What you are describing, Thessel said, is heresy. The word fell into the room with the specific weight of a word that has been sharpened over centuries of use and knows its own edge. Mara felt it. She felt it the way you feel, a physical thing, not a metaphor, an actual sensation, the kind that moves through trained loyalty like a current through water, looking for ground. She did not step back. Then I am a heretic, she said, who is declining to allow you to detain a healer who has spent 3 days keeping your faithful alive without divine assistance. You are welcome to record that. The clerk, Kael noticed, had not written anything for some time. Thessel looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man performing a rapid and thorough assessment of available options. He was not a stupid man. He understood that a physical confrontation with a trained Covenant marshal, in a hospital corridor, in front of witnesses who included patients in nearby rooms and junior staff who could see through the open ward door, was not a controlled outcome. He understood that escalation here would produce a scene that would require its own management, and that the management of the scene would delay the management of the records, and that the records were the primary concern. He said, "We will continue this conversation." "Yes," Mara said. "We will." He turned and walked back down the corridor with his guards and his clerk, and they were around the corner before the sound of their boots had fully faded, and then Mara turned and looked at Elowen and said, with the quiet urgency of someone who has bought a specific amount of time and intends to use all of it, the service passage. Now. Elowen was already gathering the records from the table. Kael was already at the treatment room's back door, the one that connected to the laundry corridor that Elowen had used 2 days ago to reach the records room, the one that was not on any official hospital plan because the hospital's official plans had been drawn before this wing's extension was added. He held it open. They did not run. Running is for emergencies that are already discovered. They moved with the deliberate speed of people who have not been found yet and intend to reach somewhere useful before they are. Aloan took the lead, because she knew the passages. Mara came last, and she did not look back, because looking back was not a thing she could afford right now. Behind them, distantly, they heard Thessel's voice issuing new orders. VI. They came out through the old service door in the hospital's north foundation wall, the one that opened onto the lane behind the tanner's row, the one that smelled of the tannery regardless of the hour, the one that Elowen had used once, years ago, when a covenant inspection had overlapped with the patient transfer she had needed to make without official paperwork. She had kept the key for the same reason she kept all her keys. The rain had thickened, not storm, just the persistent gray weight of weather that intends to stay. The cobblestones of the lane were slick and dark and empty. To the north, the road that left Bellgrave and became the Pilgrim Road, and then, further on, the road to Letharam. They moved quickly through the lanes, keeping to the parts of town that were narrow and overhung with buildings, which the rain had cleared of most foot traffic. KL carried the records under his coat, wrapped in the same cloth as the circlet. Aloan carried nothing externally. Mara carried everything she had brought with her from the hospital, which was her weapons, her professional judgment, and a decision she had made in a corridor that she could not yet assess the full weight of, because she had not yet stopped moving. At the north gate, a guard who knew Mara's face started to speak. She looked at him in a way that was not unfriendly and not a threat, and said only, "Urgent inquiry, North Road." The guard stepped aside. This was the last time her covenant rank would open a door in Bellgrave, though she did not know that yet. They walked. The town receded behind them, first the tanner's row, then the mill, then the scattered buildings of the outer quarter, then fields. The rain fell on all of it equally. They had been on the road perhaps 20 minutes when the first bell rang. Kael heard it before the others, heard the quality of it specifically, before either Mara or Aloan had fully registered it. He stopped walking. "What is it?" Aloan said. "Listen," he said. They listened. The bell was the same bell that had opened this entire episode, the same bronze instrument in the same stone tower that had rung before dawn on the first morning and rung again at noon and rung at dusk, the same bell whose absence on the first night had been the most honest thing that happened in Bellgrave during the crisis. It was ringing now with a rhythm that was not the rhythm of morning prayer or noon prayer or evening prayer, not the 1-3 pause long peal of the liturgical hours. It was the fast, uninterrupted, purposeful rhythm of a bell being rung because someone needed to communicate urgency over distance. Alarm. A second bell joined the first from the direction of the east quarter, then a third. Mara stood in the road and listened to the 3 bells and did not say anything for a moment. Then she reached up and unpinned something from her shoulder, the small enameled pin, blue and gold, that marked her rank within the Covenant's administrative structure. She looked at it for a moment, this thing she had worn for 15 years, this thing that had meant something specific about who she was and what she was authorized to do in the world. She did not throw it away. She put it in her inner coat pocket, next to nothing else, where it would be present without being visible. She said, "Where do we go?" Elowen had been walking again, not running, but at the pace of someone who knows that the distance between them and the pursuing institution is decreasing and intends to keep it from decreasing faster. She said, "The Quiet Archive." "In Letharam," Mara said. "Can it be trusted?" Elowen walked for a moment before she answered. It was not the pause of someone who does not know the answer. It was the pause of someone deciding how accurate to be about an answer that was not simple. "No," she said, "but it remembers." What does that mean? It means that whatever is in those records is safer there than anywhere else I know of. Not because the archive is honest, because it is old, and old things that have survived by recording tend to resist the erasure of what they have recorded. It means the people who maintain it have their own interests, which are not our interests, but which include not destroying what they have been given. It means, she paused again, it means it is the best option I have. Mara absorbed this. The bells were still ringing. They had a carrying quality in the wet air. Bells do. Sound travels differently in rain, refracted and extended, and the 3 bells together produced a sound that was larger than any of them individually, a sound that reached across the fields and the road and the increasing dark and found them on the north road, moving away from the town where it had originated. Cale walked between them and listened to the bells with the circlet cold against his ribs and heard, beneath the alarm rhythm, beneath the bronze voices of 3 bells doing the specific work of pursuit, the fainter accumulated sound that had not left him since the sealed chamber, all the prayers that Bellgrave's hospital had ever received, receding now with the town, growing quieter as the distance increased, the way the sound of a crowd grows quieter when you walk away from it. They were still there, all of them. He would hear them for as long as the distance was crossable. He kept walking. The 7th. I will tell you what I think the bells meant by this point, and then I will let the next chapter begin. The bell of Bellgrave's temple had rung before dawn on the morning the story begins, and it had rung with the ordinary comfort of a thing that had always been there and was expected to continue. It had rung at noon with the strange hollow quality of a ritual gesture divorced from its meaning. It had not rung at night because every hand in the town was occupied with the work of holding people alive without miraculous assistance. Now it rang as an alarm, and the two things, the dawn bell and the alarm bell, were the same instrument, the same bronze, the same rope, the same tower. The sound had not changed. What had changed was everything that had accumulated between the first ringing and this one. That is what I want you to hold as the next chapter begins, the same bell, ringing in a different key, not different because the instrument had changed. Different because everything that had happened in the space between the two ringings had made it impossible to hear the same sound the same way. They walked north through the rain toward a city they had not been invited to, and an institution whose trustworthiness was, at best, contingent. Mara carried a rank pin in her pocket and a faith in her chest that she had not discarded and did not intend to. Eloin carried the knowledge that she had been complicit in a silence she was now trying to break, and the complicated relief and shame of having finally started breaking it. Kael carried a cold relic and 200 years of other people's unanswered prayers and the specific private knowledge that his own was among them. The bells followed them into the dark.